Hello, Stillpoint Community. Welcome to the first seminar of the Critical Psychology series. My name is Maria Laguna. I'm a psychotherapist based in New York City. And today we will be discussing personality disorders through a critical lens. We will be addressing questions such as what it means to have a personality, what it means to have a disordered personality, and the different ways in which we can think about this topic from a critical lens. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy. According to the DSM manual, a personality disorder is a way of thinking, feeling, and behaving that deviates from the expectations of the culture, causes distress or problem functioning, and lasts over time. The DSM is widely considered the official classification system for use by mental health professionals. Even though this manual gives a common language to explain some aspects of human behavior and human suffering, there are many criticisms to this form of labeling. My goal is not to demonize this manual, but to understand its limitations and the relations of power underlying these diagnostic categories. One of the assumptions of the DSM is that it considers personality traits to belong to a discrete and clearly delineated category. By describing personality disorders as distinct entities that can be diagnosed and named, the DSM encourages the view that certain behaviors that are not culturally expected are medical problems. It also assumes a clear delineation between normal and abnormal, when we do know that deviations always exist along a spectrum. Another assumption, not only from the DSM, but from the mainstream psychology in general, is the assumption that people have a unique personality different from others, that this personality is stable and coherent over time, and that it's often assumed to be a biological given. Mainstream psychology leads to defining problems of living as private matters to be solved by personal growth or self-actualization. This is consistent with a neoliberal ideology that, based on the myth of meritocracy, places all the responsibility on an individual subject. One example of this trend is the phrase, "boys will be boys," which used to be a form of normalizing misogynistic attitudes and gender-based violence, making them normal while shifting the blame to women. Another hidden assumption of the mainstream discourse around personality disorders is the idea that they can be generalized to all historical periods and societies, while in fact, personality disorders are sociocultural constructions. An example of this is the proposed diagnosis of drapetomania in 1851, also known as the uncontrollable urge from a slave to escape from slavery. Slaves who, quote-unquote, suffered from the disorder reveal symptoms of their, quote-unquote, sickness, such as being disobedient, talking back, fighting with their masters, and refusing to work. According to this view, sanity for a slave was synonymous with submission, says psychologist Hope Landrine, and protest and seeking freedom were conflated with psychopathology. In this way, doctors were able to reassure the slave owners that a mental illness and not the conditions of slavery is what made slaves seek freedom. This explanation was very convenient to turn the slaves' desire for freedom into a sickness that was their problem and not the slave owner. Another example is a former diagnosis of self-defeating personality disorder, also known as masochistic personality disorder. People with this disorder are characterized by choosing people and situations that lead to disappointment, rejecting opportunities for pleasure, and engaging in excessive self-sacrifice. The feminist critique of this outdated diagnosis is that it matches the description of a typical psychologically or physically abused woman. Because of the lack of research on this diagnosis, it was decided that this category had poor diagnostic power and therefore was excluded from the DSM-4. This, once again, shows a tendency from mainstream psychology to disavow the impact of power relationships and interpersonal dynamics. Critical psychology invites us to consider, for example, non-Western approaches to think about personality. In his book, Critical Psychology, Derek Hook introduces us to some non-traditional ways of approaching personality. In traditional African thought, for example, the idea of selfhood is conceptualized in space and time. The person, in traditional African thought, is never a finished product, but it's constantly in the making. Personality, according to this view, exists only in terms of becoming. The ways of knowing, instead of being individualistic, are collectivistic and based on their contexts. The sense of we, as a collective, is more important than the sense of I. Personality is defined relationally, where individuals are part of the community they create and which in turn creates them. Personality theories may function as ideological constructions. When we ignore crucial social factors in explaining personality phenomena, we run the risk of affirming relations of inequality and oppression. A clear example of this is what we saw earlier with the masochistic personality disorder. This ascribes women's unhappiness to unresolved inner conflicts and neglects the outer aspect of domestic violence. To illustrate this, let's take a look at a current diagnosis used in the DSM-5, borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder, or BPD, is a condition diagnosed predominantly in women and is characterized by symptoms such as instability of self-identity, unstable interpersonal relationships, and shifting moods. As Paul Verhaeghe points out, when we take a look at the wider sociocultural environment, some of these borderline dispositions are embedded into our everyday existence. Intense evaluation or idealization, splitting the world in terms of good and bad, oscillating between complete indifference and passionate involvement are all present into our sociocultural landscape. Those diagnosed with BPD do indeed have serious problems, but it would be both scientifically and clinically more correct to attribute these problems to complex post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. Taking into consideration the role of trauma in this diagnosis would shift the attitudes towards people suffering from BPD. How can we theorize about personality in a way that it's humane, compassionate, and just? As critical psychologist Thomas Theo invites us to wonder, what has psychology done in the past to do justice to women, Has psychology done justice to the poor in its research? Has it done justice to racialized minorities, to people outside of the center, to people with disabilities, to LGBTQI population? Thinking of the ways in which psychology has or hasn't done justice to community problems is a crucial part of critical psychology. Thinking about power is another vital tool in critical psychology. With the medicalization of the mental health system, some interpretations tend to be presented as facts. But mental health diagnoses are not scientific facts. They're human behaviors that are influenced by power and social events. If we regard these diagnoses as facts, we risk becoming blind to the fact that they're contaminated by our subjectivity. This makes it easier for mainstream psychology to be an agent of social control under the guise of science. As Isaac Prelitensky notes in his book, Doing Psychology Critically, if power is nowhere to be seen and science is all that we do, why should people suspect our motives or even realize the power that contaminates our work? To consider the fact that we're socially enmeshed, it's another tool. Our personalities and subjectivities do not emerge in a vacuum. They exist embedded in social contexts infused with power relations such as globalization, neoliberalism, capitalism, and the forces that contribute to climate change. Emancipation. An inquiry into our personality from a critical perspective means exploring the ways in which we can enhance our human agency and the one of others, so that our conditions of systematic suffering can be changed. A critical psychologist would not be interested in classifying and labeling people as though they were scientific objects. Instead, they're interested in inquiring about what gets in the way of living our lives meaningfully, both individually and collective, how social injustice permeates our personal lives, and how power operates within the institutions that we're part of, such as family, school, work, church, among others. Focus on intersubjectivity. Critical psychology regards personality as something to transcend, according to Ian Parker. It focuses on the need to step away from the individual and focus more in one's relationship with others. In this sense, critical psychology is more concerned with intersubjectivity, also known as sharing the subjective experience between two or more people. So that was just the beginning of what I hope will be an interesting and thought-provoking conversation on critical psychology and personality. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next month. In the meantime, feel free to subscribe, make a comment, question, or thought, and reach out to the Stillpoint community. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.